From New York, this is Democracy Now!
The Hong Kong police actually fired tear gas towards the crowd, while no people are showing any symptoms of attacking. So they're just doing it. We think that they're trying to oppress our rights of expressing our opinion and actually oppressing the freedom.
Hong Kong is witnessing historic protests against a proposed bill to allow extradition of Hong Kong residents to mainland China. On Wednesday, riot police deployed tear gas, rubber bullets, pepper spray as demonstrators attempted to storm the Legislative Council building. We'll get the latest. Then to Arizona, where a hung jury has refused to convict humanitarian aid activist Professor Scott Warren, who faced up to 20 years in prison for providing water, food, clean clothes, and beds to undocumented migrants crossing the Sonoran Desert.
The government's plan in the midst of this humanitarian crisis: policies to target undocumented people, refugees, and their families. Prosecutions to criminalize humanitarian aid, kindness, and solidarity.
And outrage is mounting over the death of Laylene Polanco, a transgender Afro-Latinx woman who was recently found dead in a Rikers Island cell.
We are in a war. Don't get it twisted. We have been in a war. Black and brown trans people have been in a war since we were born. In a world that continuously tells us we shouldn't exist until they actually make it so that we don't exist.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. In the Gulf of Oman, the crews of 2 oil tankers evacuated their ships today after reporting explosions that prompted fears of a conflict between the U.S. and Iran. An image shared by Iranian state television showed a plume of smoke rising from one of the 2 vessels east of the Strait of Hormuz. Taiwan's state oil refinery, which owns one of the 2 tankers, said it suspected its ship had been hit by a torpedo. Iran denied involvement and said through a state news agency Iran's Navy had helped to safely evacuate 44 sailors from the stricken vessels. U.S. National Security Advisor John Bolton, who's frequently called for U.S. military action against Iran, blamed Iran for attacks on oil tankers off the coast of the United Arab Emirates last month without providing evidence. The House Oversight Committee voted Wednesday to hold Attorney General William Barr and Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross in contempt of Congress for refusing to comply with congressional subpoenas. The vote came just hours after the Justice Department said President Trump had declared executive privilege in a bid to keep the documents from the public record. Democrats are seeking information on how Trump administration officials sought to add a citizenship question to the 2020 census. Last month, the New York Times reported a senior Republican strategist who specialized in gerrymandering was secretly behind the efforts, arguing privately that adding the question would benefit Republicans and hurt Democrats. This is New York Congressmember Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez speaking at Wednesday's House Oversight hearing.
I want to know why this question was magically added after we have seen that a political operative knew and detailed an intent to intimidate racial and immigrant communities for a partisan purpose, saying this will hurt Democrats and help Republicans. That's what I want to know. I want to know why why Secretary Ross continued to meet with people of disturbing political affiliations after his own administration warned him to stop. He came right here and I asked him, did you continue speaking with him after this? He told me no, we had an email, and he did. He did.
Donald Trump Jr. testified before the Senate Intelligence Committee in a closed-door session about an email he received in the spring of 2016 from someone he believed to be a Russian government attorney promising dirt on Hillary Clinton. Trump Jr. accepted the invitation and scheduled a meeting at Trump Tower with the official in June of 2016. Meanwhile, President Trump said Wednesday he would accept damaging information on campaign rivals from foreign actors and might not even alert alert the FBI about efforts by a foreign adversary to intervene in the U.S. election. Speaking with ABC News anchor George Stephanopoulos in the Oval Office, Trump said his son, Donald Trump Jr., was right not to inform the FBI about the 2016 Trump Tower meeting.
I've seen a lot of things over my life. I don't think in my whole life I've ever called the FBI. In my whole life. You don't call the FBI. You throw somebody out of your office, you do whatever you do.
Al Gore got a stolen briefing book. He called the FBI.
Well, that's different, a stolen briefing book. This isn't a stolen. This is somebody that said, we have information on your opponent. Oh, let me call the FBI. Give me a break. Life doesn't work that way.
The FBI director says that's what should happen.
The FBI director is wrong.
President Trump's hand-picked FBI Director Christopher Wray told Congress just last month that the FBI would want to know if a public official or a campaign was contacted by a foreign government seeking to interfere in an election. President Trump dismissed the notion, saying he would consider accepting opposition research if a foreign figure approached him. Meanwhile, President Trump welcomed Polish President Andrzej Duda to the White House on Wednesday, signing a military agreement to station an additional 1,000 U.S. troops in Poland. Their announcement came as the U.S. Marine Corps executed a rare flyover of an F-35 stealth fighter jet over the White House as Presidents Trump and Duda looked on from the South Lawn. Trump said Poland had agreed in return to purchase at least 32 of the Lockheed Martin stealth fighter jets. The F-35 program has been marked by multi-billion-dollar cost overruns, with the Pentagon's own estimates putting the cost of maintaining the jets at nearly $1.2 trillion in the coming decades. In the Arabian Peninsula, Houthi rebels from Yemen attacked an airport in southern Saudi Arabia Wednesday, injuring 26 civilians in the airport's arrival hall. A Houthi spokesman called the missile attack retribution for the U.S.-backed Saudi-led coalition's continued aggression and blockade against Yemen. Meanwhile, on Capitol Hill, House lawmakers grilled senior State Department officials Wednesday over the Trump administration's plans to circumvent Congress to sell over $8 billion of precision-guided bombs and other weapons to Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates without congressional approval. Assistant U.S. Secretary of State Clark Cooper defended President Trump's decision in May to declare a national emergency in order to complete the arms sales, citing a threat from Saudi Arabia's regional rival, Iran. House Foreign Affairs Committee Chair Eliot Engel called Trump's declaration phony and an abuse of the law. This is Clark Cooper being questioned by Rhode Island Democratic Congressmember David Cicilline.
The vast majority of the arms the administration wants to sell with respect to this transaction are offensive weapons, correct?
It's not limited to that. There's sustainment.
It didn't say limited. The vast majority are offensive weapons.
There are offensive weapons. There are sustainment packages.
But the vast majority are offensive. Isn't that correct, sir?
A number of them are offensive.
The U.S.-backed war in Yemen has killed thousands of civilians and sparked the world's worst humanitarian crisis, pushing half of Yemen's 28 million people to the brink of famine. Authorities in Hong Kong have shut down government offices and postponed debate in the Legislative Council one day after riot police fired tear gas, rubber bullets and pepper spray at tens of thousands of demonstrators who took to the streets to protest a bill that would allow the extradition of Hong Kong residents to mainland China. This comes after as many as 1 million protesters marched against the extradition bill on Sunday. The protests are some of the largest Hong Kong has seen since before Britain's handover of Hong Kong in 1997. After headlines, we'll go to Hong Kong for the latest. In Mexico, crime reporter Norma Sarabia was shot and killed in the southern state of Tabasco late Tuesday, becoming the 6th journalist to be assassinated in Mexico this year. Police say 2 masked men on a motorbike shot Sarabia repeatedly outside her home before fleeing the scene. In the neighboring state of Veracruz, armed men raided the home of journalist Marcos Miranda Cagco and kidnapped him. On Wednesday, Cagco's wife pleaded for his return, noting he's received death threats for years over his critical reporting on local government officials. Reporters Without Borders has called Mexico the world's deadliest country for media workers outside of an active war zone. Elsewhere in Mexico, 2 immigration activists known for their work assisting Central American migrants who were arrested on June 5th were freed from jail Wednesday ahead of their upcoming trials. The arrests of Ireneo Mujica and Cristobal Sanchez earlier this month came as President Trump threatened to impose tariffs on Mexican imports unless the Mexican government agreed to crack down on asylum seekers headed for the U.S.-Mexico border. On Wednesday, a judge ruled the pair should not be held in pretrial custody as they await trial on human trafficking charges. Mujica has worked closely with Scott Warren, the humanitarian aid volunteer with the group No More Deaths in Tucson, Arizona. Later in the broadcast, we'll go to Tucson, Arizona, where a federal judge has just declared a mistrial in a criminal case against Scott Warren that could see him sentenced to up to 20 years in prison for providing water, clean clothes and beds to 2 asylum seekers in the Sonoran Desert. In Uganda, health officials say a 5-year-old boy and his mother have died after falling ill with Ebola, the first deaths among 8 new suspected cases of the deadly virus reported in Uganda. The deaths came as health workers in the neighboring Democratic Republic of Congo warn a massive Ebola outbreak has become the 2nd worst on record, with over 2,000 new cases and nearly 1,400 deaths since last August. Medical workers are struggling to reach infected people amidst ongoing violence by anti-government militias, as well as widespread mistrust of foreign medical workers. In South Dakota, members of the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe on Monday turned around a truck believed to be carrying construction equipment for the Keystone XL oil pipeline. In a statement, Tribal Chair Harold Frazier said, quote, "Any vehicles or personnel working on the Keystone XL pipeline are not welcome on this reservation. This is Sioux territory. We will not stand for more encroachments and defilement of our land," he said. The Keystone XL pipeline has long been opposed by environmentalists, farmers, and Native Americans. If completed, the pipeline would carry oil from Canada's tar sands region in Alberta to refineries as far away as the Gulf of Mexico. Former Stanford University sailing coach John Vandermoor has avoided a possible prison term for his role in a college admissions cheating scandal that saw wealthy and powerful parents spend millions of dollars in bribes to get their children into elite universities. On Wednesday, a U.S. District Court judge in Boston sentenced Vandermoor to 2 years supervised release and a $10,000 fine after he pleaded guilty to racketeering conspiracy charges. Prosecutors asked for a 13-month prison sentence. They say Vandermoor took in over $600,000 in bribes to fast-track student applicants for Stanford's sailing team, funneling the money to the Stanford sailing program. The 2 students he received the bribes for did not attend Stanford. Britain's Home Secretary has signed a formal request for WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange to be extradited to the United States, where he faces 17 counts of violating the Espionage Act in the first-ever case of a journalist or publisher being indicted under the World War I-era law. British courts will now decide whether to honor the extradition request. Assange is currently behind bars at London's Belmarsh prison for skipping bail in 2012 after being forcibly removed from the Ecuadorian embassy by British police in April. And Vermont Senator and 2020 presidential hopeful Bernie Sanders offered a vigorous defense of democratic socialism in a major address Wednesday at George Washington University, vowing to complete the unfinished promise of FDR's New Deal and work towards economic rights for all.
When Trump attacks socialism, I am reminded again of what Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, and I quote, "This country has socialism for the rich, rugged individualism for the poor," end quote. And that is the difference between Donald Trump and me. He believes in corporate socialism for the rich and powerful. I believe in a democratic socialism that works for the working families of this country.
And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Nermeen Sheikh. Welcome to our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. We begin today's show in Hong Kong, where authorities have shut down government offices and postponed debate in the Legislative Council 1 day after riot police fired tear gas, rubber bullets and pepper spray at tens of thousands of demonstrators who took to the streets to protest a bill that would allow the extradition of Hong Kong residents to mainland China. On Wednesday, demonstrators attempted to storm the Legislative Council building, where lawmakers are debating the extradition bill. Human Rights Watch criticized Hong Kong authorities for using what it described as excessive force to suppress peaceful demonstrations. Protesters described the police using indiscriminate force.
The Hong Kong police actually fired tear gas towards the crowd, while no people are showing any symptoms of attacking. So they're just doing it. We think that they're trying to oppress our rights of expressing our opinion and actually oppressing the freedom.
This came days after as many as 1 million protesters marched in Hong Kong against the extradition bill Sunday. The protests are some of the largest Hong Kong has seen since before Britain's handover of Hong Kong in 1997. Since then, Hong Kong has operated under a different legal and political system as mainland China, a setup known as one country, two systems. Critics of the extradition bill say it would infringe on Hong Kong's independence and the legal and human rights of Hong Kong residents, as well as the people visiting Hong Kong. We go now to Hong Kong, where we're joined by Mary Hui. She's a Hong Kong-based writer, reporter for the news outlet Quartz. She's reported on the extradition bill and has been covering the mass protests. Welcome to Democracy Now!, Mary. Can you start off by talking about the significance of this bill that was passed? Just explain it.
Sure, and thank you for having me, Amy. The significance of this bill really is that it will threaten Hong Kong's prized judicial and legal independence. It is, as Chris Patten, the former governor, has said, there needs to be a firewall between Hong Kong's legal system and China's. And with this bill, should it be passed, that firewall will be done away with, and it means that it will mean the death of one country, two systems, because there will no longer be this firewall, and there's the possibility that people will be able to be extradited to China to face charges where they face an uncertain fate as to whether they will face a fair trial or even have their human rights protected.
Well, Mary Hui, could you outline what the key features of this proposed amendment are?
Sure. So as the law currently stands, Hong Kong has signed extradition treaties with 20 other jurisdictions, the US being one of them. And what this law is trying to do is to work around that. Under the current law, the People's Republic of China is actually explicitly ruled out as a place that people can be extradited to. And so there is no extradition at all to China under the current law. And last year, there was a murder case. The young Hong Kong couple traveled to Taiwan. The boyfriend was accused of murdering the girlfriend and fled back to Hong Kong. And because China sees Taiwan as part of the People's Republic of China, there is no extradition between Hong Kong and Taiwan. And so the Hong Kong government has then come around and said, well, there's this major loophole in that this suspected murderer is not able to face any charges and won't face justice. And so they took this opportunity to say we have to reform and amend this bill to make sure that this suspected murderer can face charges and be brought to justice. And how do we do this? We plug this loophole in the language of the government by doing away with the restriction of the People's Republic of China and saying that there can be one-off extradition agreements between Hong Kong and China.
I want to read a recent tweet from the exiled Chinese writer Ma Jian, who on Twitter said, "At the Hong Kong Literary Festival in November, a friend accompanied me at all times for fear I'd be secretly kidnapped and smuggled to China. If the extradition law passes, any critic of Xi's regime could be legally, openly abducted. It would be the end of freedom in Hong Kong, Ma Jian said. Your response, Mary Hoy?
I think that is a very, very reasonable fear, and people are afraid of that, not just writers of Chinese descent, but also foreigners. Hong Kong is a financial hub, an international media hub. There are lots of human rights advocacy groups here, and for them, if doing their work means angering China, then they will very likely be accused of committing a certain crime, and China will be able to find a way to have them extradited to face charges in China, in mainland China. And so what this means is that China will be able to use this bill as retaliation against opponents, whether it's Hong Kong Chinese or foreigners who are traveling to or based in Hong Kong.
Mary, could you explain who's behind this proposed amendment, and why is it being proposed now?
Yes. So really who's behind it is the Hong Kong government, but who's behind the Hong Kong government is the Beijing government. The Hong Kong government has insisted that this is their own initiative. Chief Executive Carrie Lam has repeatedly said that this is her making, the Hong Kong government's making. There is no instruction from the Chinese government, though the top official based in Hong Kong, the top Chinese official, has made the unusual move of trying to persuade Hong Kong politicians to back the extradition bill. So as to whether China really isn't behind this bill is uncertain, and I'm doubtful of that.
Could you describe, Mary, the kinds of the protests that are taking place and the violent crackdown by the police in Hong Kong against the protesters?
Mm-hmm. So the protesters started gathering outside the central government offices on Tuesday night, local time here. And overnight, their numbers grew. And so by the time I arrived at the protest scene at about 9 a.m. during rush hour traffic, tens of thousands of people had gathered and taken over just vast swaths of this highway outside of the central government offices. And so from the looks of it, it was calm, quiet for much of the morning. I was there until about 2 p.m. and really all I saw were protesters being very well organized. They had set up supply stations. They were collecting umbrellas to repel against pepper spray and tear gas that they were expecting to be fired at them. They were collecting water and medical supplies. They were erecting barriers around the protest site. They were handing out masks to passers-by. People were insisting that I take their masks as a journalist because they expected tear gas to be fired. And so there was this sense of camaraderie. There wasn't too much really going on at that point. At points, there was a sense of tension as police and the protesters just stood 10 meters away from each other, the front line of protesters, police and riot gear, but really not much happened. And it was not until around 3:30 local time here that clashes broke out. I should say that by that time I'd actually left the protest site and gone back to the newsroom for the rest of the day. So I did not personally see the clashes, but from what I've seen online, from videos that I've been watching, it really does not seem like protesters were the ones starting any kind of confrontation with the police. The police were trying to disperse them and ended up aggravating the crowd.
According to the New York Times, it's estimated 1 in 7 Hong Kong residents took part in Sunday's protests. And in the New York Times on Monday, Hong Kong's Commissioner to the United States, Eddie Mack, outlined his government's position, writing, "The Hong Kong government's proposed amendments to extradition laws seek to enable us to effectively combat serious crimes by sealing the legal vacuum in our existing mechanism for surrendering fugitive offenders. They do not pinpoint any particular jurisdiction, nor do they target common citizens or affect the legal rights and freedoms of individuals." If you could respond to that and the fact that what the Chinese authorities have done in the past, for example, the abducting of Hong Kong residents, 5 Hong Kong booksellers in 2015.
Yes, there really is no trust of the Chinese government. with the protesters I've spoken to, that's the one thing really that they've all mentioned when I asked them what about the Hong Kong government's amendments and assurances that your freedoms won't be trampled upon. And time again, the protesters tell me we don't trust the Chinese Communist Party, the Chinese government. It's all a bunch of lies. And so any assurance that the freedom of speech, the freedom of assembly, as they exist in Hong Kong now, will not be trampled upon, I don't think those assurances hold any water.
And those booksellers?
And the booksellers, of course, there is that precedent of Chinese government coming in and essentially launching this global campaign, not just in Hong Kong, but elsewhere, of state-sponsored kidnapping. And so with the booksellers, I think people have looked at that and seen how the Chinese government will behave without an extradition bill legalizing and legitimizing their behavior. And so with the bill, I think what we'll see is just this legitimizing of state-sponsored kidnapping, as some people have called it.
Well, Mary, before we conclude, what do you expect to happen next? Will this amendment pass, and do you expect the protests to continue?
So the debate over the bill in the legislature has been postponed until next week. It's unsure whether protesters will come out again, though my gut feeling is that if the debate is to continue and a vote is taken, it will very likely pass, given that the legislature is stacked with pro-Beijing, pro-China parties and politicians. Should it pass, I'm sure the anger will boil over, the popular anger will boil over, and protesters will be out again to stand for their freedoms.
Mary Hoy, I want to thank you for being with us. Hong Kong-based writer and reporter for the news outlet Quartz, reported on the extradition bill, has been covering the protests. We'll continue, of course, to cover all. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, a professor in Arizona is met with the response of a hung jury. They refused to convict him for aiding migrants in the brutal Sonoran Desert. Stay with us. Lonesome Valley, performed by Shoo Shoo. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
In Tucson, Arizona, a jury has refused to convict humanitarian activist Scott Warren, who faced up to 20 years in prison for providing water, food, clean clothes, and beds to 2 undocumented migrants crossing the Sonoran Desert in southern Arizona. Warren's trial ended Tuesday in a mistrial after a deadlocked jury was unable to deliver a verdict. 8 jurors thought Warren was not guilty. 4 thought he was guilty. A status hearing is scheduled for July 2nd. Prosecutors have declined to comment on whether they would seek a retrial against Warren. Warren briefly spoke to supporters outside Tucson's federal courthouse, where the hung jury was declared.
Since my arrest in January of 2018, at least 88 bodies were recovered from the Ajo corridor of the Arizona desert. We know that's a minimum number and that many more are out there and have not been found. The government's plan in the midst of this humanitarian crisis, policies to target undocumented people, refugees, and their families, prosecutions to criminalize humanitarian aid, kindness, and solidarity. And now, where I live, the revelation that they will build an enormous and expensive wall across a vast stretch of southwestern Arizona's unbroken Sonoran Desert. Today, it remains as necessary as ever for local residents and humanitarian aid volunteers to stand in solidarity with migrants and refugees. And we must also stand for our families, friends, and neighbors in the very land itself, most threatened by the militarization of our borderland communities. I've received enormous support from family, friends, lawyers, and my community. Thank you to everyone, and I want to say that I love you all very, very much.
We love you, Scott.
If you can, though, take a moment now and get some rest. But the other men arrested with me that day, Jose Zacaria Gude and Cristian Perez Villanueva, have not received the attention and outpouring of support that I have. I do not know how they are doing now, but I desperately hope that they are safe.
Scott Warren is an activist with Ajo Samaritans and No More Deaths, which for years has left water and food in the harsh Sonoran Desert, where the temperature often reaches 3 digits during summer, to help refugees and migrants survive the deadly journey across the U.S. border. When Warren testified last week, he told jurors his actions were motivated by 3 intentions: relief of suffering, respect for human dignity, and the right to self-determination. While presenting the case against Warren, U.S. Attorney Anna Wright said, quote, "He gave them food, he gave them water. He did a bad thing. This is not a case about deaths in the desert."
Scott Warren was arrested January 17, 2018, just hours after No More Deaths released a report detailing how U.S. Border Patrol agents had intentionally destroyed more than 3,000 gallons of water left out for migrants crossing the border. The group also published a video showing border agents dumping out jugs of water in the desert. Hours after the report was published, authorities raided the barn, a No More Deaths aid camp in Ajo, where they found 2 migrants who had sought temporary refuge. We're joined right now by Ryan Devereaux, staff reporter at The Intercept, who's closely covered Scott Warren's trial and the criminalization of humanitarian aid volunteers for more than a year. It's great to have you back, Ryan. You've just flown back from Arizona covering this trial that took about 2 weeks. Talk about the significance of the verdict. It's a hung jury. 8 for Scott Warren, 4 against.
Correct. It was an outcome that I personally wasn't expecting. I expected that this was going to go one way or the other, guilty or not guilty. The hung jury, which came after 3 days of deliberation, was not something I think anybody was really expecting here. It's quite a turn to a case that's already taken a lot of turns. The story's not over for Scott Warren and his defense team. This is not necessarily a defeat, but it's not a victory either. We don't yet know if the government is going to retry this case. As you mentioned at the top of the show, there's a status hearing coming in July. So a lot of the questions surrounding this case, its significance, the potential precedent it could set, are still alive, and that precedent includes the possibility of a broadened crackdown on humanitarian aid work in the desert, potential targeting of folks who have undocumented people in their lives, potential targeting of mixed status families in the United States. There's a whole lot on the line with respect to this case, and those questions are still very much alive.
And you've said, Ryan, that the crucial question for the jury was about Scott Warren's intention. Explain what that means and the significance of that for the fact that there was a mistrial.
Yeah, so 19 months after this arrest, we've seen a lot of evidence in this case, hundreds of filings. The government brought many witnesses, as did Scott's defense team, but what it all really boiled down to was intent. Did Scott Warren intend to shield these men from law enforcement, knowing that he was in violation of the law? If so, the government argued then he was guilty. Scott Warren's attorneys said that, yeah, intent is critical to this. And Scott Warren's intent in this case was to provide humanitarian aid. And that's been his intent all along in working in the borderlands for the last 4 years. So jurors heard about how Scott behaved and what he did in the hours and days after these two young men arrived at the bar in this humanitarian aid station in Ajo, Arizona. Scott Warren attended to the migrants' feet. They had blisters on their feet. One was reporting sore ribs. He took down notes about their medical conditions. He called a doctor who the organization No More Deaths works with, has worked with for years, an award-winning physician. He reported the conditions that these young men were in. He was advised that they should stay off their feet and that they should rehydrate, and that volunteers should keep an eye on them for the next few days. The government, in its arguments in court over the last week, said that the notes that Scott Warren took during this period were part of a cover-up. They took these notes, No More Deaths, Scott, in order to be able to say that they were providing medical aid when in fact they were just trying to help these men enter the country. They argued that Scott's real intent is to thwart the Border Patrol at every turn.
Let's go to Scott in his own words, talking about finding the remains of migrants who have died while crossing into the United States. This is a clip from The Intercept's mini documentary titled "Let Them Have Water."
We went from finding human remains every other month to like finding 5 sets of human remains on a single trip, hiking through the Growler Valley, and then going back, a week later and finding 2 more sets of remains, and then on a single day of searching, finding like 8 sets of remains and bodies of people who had died in adjacent areas of the bombing range and on Cabeza Prieta. So just this like scale of this crisis, of the humanitarian crisis and the missing persons crisis, just blew wide open.
So that's Scott Warren. The government says this isn't about deaths, but since 2001, at least 3,000 migrants have been found dead in the southern Arizona desert. Thousands of others have disappeared. Activists say the numbers are probably much higher. Talk about the government saying it's not about deaths, and of course Scott Warren's argument in the name of his organization, No More Deaths.
Yeah, the government began this trial by arguing that this is not a case about humanitarian aid and deaths in the desert. This is a case about Scott Warren and Scott Warren's actions. But what happened in the days that followed is the government put on many, many arguments about humanitarian aid and said that what No More Deaths and groups like it are doing is a political project. It's not a humanitarian project. That's false. That their entire goal is humanitarian aid. The government alleged that, in fact, these groups are political actors with political goals. It's important to keep in mind when we're talking about all of this that the deaths in the desert are the result of a policy that began some 25 years ago under the Clinton administration. It's called prevention through deterrence. And under this strategy, migrant populations are funneled into the deadliest parts of the desert. And increasingly, in the last several years, that's been the Ajo corridor, where Scott lives and works. And beginning in 2014, Scott brought together a sort of network of humanitarian aid groups in the area to really start focusing on this region. And what they uncovered was just a pattern of death and disappearance that really rivaled anything else in the Sonoran Desert. So they started going out, dropping water, and looking often for people who were reported missing or bodies that were reported. And they contributed to a historic increase in the number of remains and bodies found in that region during that particular time period. As that happened, the government escalated its crackdown on their work.
Well, I just want to turn to Amnesty International America's director, who's called for Warren's charges to be dropped in light of the mistrial. She said in a statement, quote, "The mistrial in the case of Dr. Scott Warren sends a clear message that there are people in the USA who refuse to acquiesce to the government's attempts to criminalize compassion and humanitarian aid. As long as the USA and Mexico fail to protect the lives of migrants and asylum seekers between the two countries, human rights defenders like Scott Warren must be allowed to continue their necessary and life-saving work, unhampered by politically motivated harassment and prosecution." So, Ryan, what do you think happens now?
Well, now we wait. We see if the government is going to retry this case or not. But we should note that Scott Warren's prosecution takes place against a backdrop of targeting of humanitarian aid workers, immigrant rights advocates across the border. Just earlier this year, we saw lawyers, activists, journalists in the Tijuana, San Diego area who had worked with members of the migrant caravan, targeted by a sweeping intelligence gathering operation carried out by CBP, ICE, and law enforcement in that area. So this is not confined just to Scott's case. It's part of the broader crackdown on immigrants that we've seen under the Trump administration.
Ryan Devereaux, we want to thank you so much for being with us, staff reporter at The Intercept, where he covers immigration enforcement, the drug war, national security. His most recent article, which we will link to at democracynow.org, Felony Trial of No More Deaths volunteer Scott Warren ends in mistrial. In May, he published Bodies in the Borderlands, an extensive investigation into Scott Warren's case. When we come back, outrage is mounting over the death of Layleen Polanco, a transgender Afro-Latinx woman who was found dead in a cell at Rikers Island on Friday. Stay with us.
Cold unite, and I'm feeling like it's fight or flight with you. Ooh. Well, I wish I may, yes, I wish I might, but there's no stars in sight tonight. It's cold, it's cold, it's cold, it's cold, and the night is dark.
La Nuit by Amarasu, featuring Pale Eyes. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
Outrage is mounting over the death of Layleen Polanco, a transgender Afro-Latinx woman who was found dead in a cell at Rikers Island on Friday. Polanco was arrested on misdemeanor charges and jailed on Rikers in April when she was unable to post $500 bail. Nearly 2 months later, she was dead. Her family, friends, and transgender rights activists are now demanding answers for the conditions that led to the 27-year-old's death. The city says the cause of death has not yet been determined. Polanco was held in a unit for transgender women while jailed at Rikers, but a week before her death, she was transferred to so-called restrictive housing, an arrangement Polanco's lawyer says amounts to solitary confinement.
Layleen's death came at the beginning of Pride Month, and just one day after the New York Police Department apologized for the first time for its raid a half-century ago on the Stonewall Inn, a gay and trans-friendly bar in Manhattan's Greenwich Village. In June of '69, the inn was the site of a violent police raid that triggered an uprising and helped launch the modern-day LGBTQ rights movement. Hundreds gathered in New York City Monday to demand justice for Layleen Polanco and demand Rikers be shut down immediately. Democracy Now! Is there in the streets. This video begins with transgender rights activist Cecilia Gentili speaking at Foley Square.
Layleen loved New York. That you couldn't get her out of here. She loved the building. She loved the vibe. She loved the people of New York City. And ultimately, it has been this city what led to these circumstances. And we need to ask for answers. And we need to change the criminal law. It is crazy that people like her and people like me and people like most of us can end up in that hole of Rikers Island for petty that we did.
Black and brown trans women of color are not protected federally through this current administration. And in this month of June, there is no pride in knowing that the injustices of transgender women of color and the state-sanctioned violence continues to be perpetuated, and the deaths of transgender women, black transgender women, continue to be a leading epidemic in our communities.
Tell them the truth. Trans rights
our human rights, trans people, our people. We only want to live, be free, and be safe. We are in a war. Don't get it twisted. We have been in a war. Black and brown trans people have been in a war since we were born. Yeah. In a world that continuously tells us we shouldn't exist until they actually make it so that we don't exist. And so if you are invoking the names of Marsha, or invoking the names of Sylvia, or Miss Major, or Storm May, or any of these architects of our movement, Amanda Malign, and so many others, you if you are not centering black and brown trans folks.
As a formerly incarcerated, a former sex worker, I know I can almost imagine what she went through in those corridors. I myself remember being made fun of, being treated subhuman just to go get my medication from the medication window. Or how about picking up my commissary? Or how about going to visit my loved ones on the floor and have my family and myself subjected to those vicious things that the police did to us? I can almost imagine how she felt subhuman, being chained, going to seek personal help for herself. How many grievances were probably overlooked? How many times the boys have bullied her and the police turned a deaf eye or a deaf ear? I appreciate everyone showing up in this space in her death. But where are we when we are living and breathing? I need that same anger. I need that same wrath. I need you to pack the courtroom. How the hell does a misdemeanor result in a death sentence?
That was Tabitha Gonzalez with the Transgender Legal Defense and Educational Fund. For more, we're joined now in studio by two guests. Raquel Willis is a transgender activist and writer, executive editor of Out magazine, and Joel Wertheimer is an attorney representing the family of Layleen Polenko. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Joel, let's begin with you. What happened to Layleen? Why was she in Rikers?
So there's still a lot we're figuring out about what happened. She was arrested in April on misdemeanor charges. We believe that did not have bail set. There was another warrant outstanding.
You mean she would have been just released?
Yeah, they set $1 bail, which is a technical thing. But she would have been released if this other warrant hadn't been issued that was from a human trafficking intervention court. And that was only $500, and she wouldn't be in jail under the new bail law, which is supposed to go in effect in New York State in 2020, but prosecutors are still seeking bail.
So how long had she spent in jail just because she couldn't raise the $500?
From mid-April until the day she died.
Over 2 months?
Just under, yeah.
Just under.
Raquel, can you talk about the impact of Layleen's death? I mean, she's one just in a series, numerous deaths of black trans women killed either by civilians or by the state. So could you talk about the impact of this on the transgender community?
Absolutely. I mean, it's been a particularly heavy year. There have been 10 trans women reported murdered this year. We know that there are always probably more that go unreported. And it is just really heavy because it is the 50th anniversary of Stonewall, right? This is our Pride Month. And so while there's so much celebration and excitement around the strides that we have made as a community, these are sobering reminders of how much further we have to go. And so I think about Layleen's case and how even in the discussion of the murders and violence that happens to black and brown trans bodies, there's such an erasure of people who are incarcerated or people who are detained and in respecting their humanity and why they should still be here. So on the very first day of Pride Month, even before what happened to Layleen, there was Joanna Medina, a trans Latinx person seeking asylum who died in ICE custody on June 1st. And so all of this is happening while in the background there's these celebrations ignoring these realities.
And of course, this is Pride Month. Back to Layleen at Rikers Island. Why was she in solitary confinement? I mean, this so much reminds me of Sandra Bland, right, who couldn't raise the $500 she needed to get out.
We still don't know exactly why she was placed in restrictive housing and the punitive segregation unit. The Department of Correction has been stony with us, to say the least.
She was in a transgender unit at Rikers?
She was, to begin with. That was, Rikers is one of the few jails that actually has a transgender unit, but then she was transferred to the punitive segregation unit, which is solitary or minimal freedom while you're incarcerated.
And how did she die?
Again, that's still being determined. We have suspicions, but I don't want to speculate too much. She did have epilepsy. She had a seizure condition, and we don't know how frequently that she was being checked on. But we're still waiting for the medical examiner to determine the cause of death.
Well, I want to turn to New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio, who's now, of course, running for president, speaking about Layleen Polanco's death on New York 1. He was asked why she was in custody for nearly 2 months for 2 misdemeanor charges.
Well, that's unusual, and I don't know. I need to get you an answer on why that would be. Obviously, we've been moving consistently to have alternatives to incarceration. And our jail population is down over 30% in the last 5 years, and it's about to go down a whole lot more because, thankfully, Albany acted and did some important reforms on bail, but there's more work to be done on that front on several levels. Mm-hmm. So I need to get the facts about this case, but, most importantly, she's no longer with us, and we have to find out why.
In May, Mayor de Blasio promised to protect transgender New Yorkers, dedicating a monument to legendary transgender activists Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera. So, Raquel, your response to what the mayor said and what the mayor has promised?
Yes, I mean, I think that it's great that we are honoring these figures, right? But we forget the facts of their lives. Marsha and Sylvia were women who were fighting for people who are incarcerated, for people who have had very difficult experiences and interactions with law enforcement and the state. And so while it's great we have these monuments, we have to continue this fight.
And of course, Sylvia Rivera back 50 years ago at the Stonewall Inn.
Absolutely.
We wanted to end with transgender actor and model India Moore, star of the FX show Pose, speaking at the New York protests Monday to demand justice for Layleen Polanco.
I just first want to start by noting the recorded trans women and people who have been murdered, most of which there have been no arrests. There are no leads. And as we all know, our papers, our cases are at the bottom of the pile always. Jesusa Fidel Ventura Reyes, 25-year-old Mexican trans woman of color, better known as Chucha. She went missing on the night of May 17. The authorities later found her head severed in a cooler outside of Town Hall in Fortin de las Flores. Her decapitated body was later found in the streets of Mexico. Camila Diaz Cordova, 25. She was a 29-year-old trans woman who was killed in El Salvador after being deported from the United States. Dana Martin, 31, a trans woman of color, was found shot to death in her vehicle in a roadside ditch about 11 p.m. Sunday, 6 January in Montgomery, Alabama. Ashanti Cameron, 27, a trans woman of color, slain by gun violence in Maryland. Claire Legato, 21, a trans woman of color, shot in the head on April 15th after an argument broke out between her mother and a suspect in Cleveland, Ohio. She was defending her mother from someone that stole from her. Malaysia Brooker, 23. A trans woman of color was found shot and killed after 6:40 a.m. Saturday, 18th, in Dallas, Texas. The shooting comes after a little more than a month since a viral video that we all saw of her being beaten and dragged across the street in her own community by her own brothers. After speaking at I don't know if it was a rally or a media correspondent thing, but after speaking, she spoke publicly saying, "This time, I can stand before you, whereas in other scenarios, we're at a memorial." And now that's now where her family saw her a few weeks after she said those words. That's where she was last seen by her family. Michelle Tamika Washington, 40 years old, a trans woman of color and longtime transgender rights advocate, was shot. Again, by gun violence. Paris Cameron, 20, was shot in Detroit, Michigan on Saturday, 25 in May, on Memorial Weekend, by gun violence. Chanel Lindsay, 26, a trans woman of color, was found in White Rock Lake, Dallas, Texas at 5:45 on Saturday, 1st June. She was the second trans murder in Dallas, following Malaysia, just 2 weeks apart. Lindsay's body was discovered only a mile away from where Booker's body was discovered. Chanel Skurlock, 23, a trans woman of color, was shot and killed in Lumberton, North Carolina. Her body was found in a field. Jazeline Ware, a black trans woman, was found dead in her Memphis apartment in March. Layleen Polanco, the most recently slain trans woman of color, a black trans woman. I looked up to her, just wanted to say, you know, when you're a young trans person, you have the trans women and people around you to look to when you imagine where you want to see yourself in your life. Layleen was one of those girls for me. Cis hetero people are deciding whether or not we deserve human rights, and that must end. We cannot lean on the understanding or empathy of cis hetero people to protect and fight for our basic human rights. Our freedom to exist and access employment, shelter, education, safety, healthcare, or anything else that we need to thrive should not be at the mercy to people who do not share our experiences or let alone believe we don't deserve to live or thrive. We need our government to listen to us in regards to our needs, not listen to cis people in regards to our needs. We are all worthy of safety and protection everywhere, including in our own homes, with our own families, and shelters in our own neighborhoods, and churches, and schools, and jobs, and hospitals, and clinics, and communities, and cities, and country, and world. We are worthy of legal aid, liberty, justice, resources, and we are worthy of life. We are worthy of love. If the sight of us using our bodies, our voices, and our defiance to protest this oppressive administration and the people who endorse it, and the religions that are fighting for the right to dispose us as a spiritual practice, and police, prison, and a political system that is giving the world permission to dispose of us, disturbs and frightens you more than our mysteriously dead bodies in the custody of Rikers Island and ICE, and the sight of us being beaten and dragged up and down the gravel of the streets of our streets in Dallas and beyond, shot up and decapitated on the stairs of City Hall in Mexico, we will not back down and rest in peace no more.
The trans actor India Moore, speaking at a protest on Monday. Time magazine recently named her one of the world's 100 most influential people of 2019. She also recently became the first trans woman on the cover of Elle magazine as she spoke honoring Layleen Polanco. Your final comment, Raquel Willis.
Absolutely. We have to invest in Black and brown trans leadership, so all of the initiatives that are led by us and fighting for us need to be supported, whether that's donating, volunteering, or just elevating the work that we're doing.
Raquel Willis, executive editor of Out Magazine. Attorney Joel Wertheimer, thank you so much for joining us. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. This is Democracy Now!